For millennia, the Great Pyramid of Giza has stood tall amidst the desert, more like a natural wonder than a man-made structure. The colossal stone blocks stacked into a perfect triangular shape continue to astonish future generations. How can ancient civilization have built such eternal monuments? Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, was once shrouded in a veil of mystery. The ancient Greeks praised it, the Romans admired it. But for centuries, the writing system of the Egyptians was lost, turning an entire civilization into a silent enigma. Until one summer day, July 19, 1799, during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, a French soldier happened upon a strange stone slab near the town of Rosetta, roughly 35 miles from Alexandria. On its surface, the same inscription was carved in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. The Rosetta Stone. It became the key that unlocked the door closed for thousands of years. Thanks to that translation, humanity finally deciphered the voice of an ancient civilization. And when Egypt spoke again, everything began with the Nile River, the longest river in the world. It flooded annually, carrying silt from distant highlands to enrich the farmlands, transforming arid desert into fertile ground. From this river, people planted seeds, raised livestock, built villages. A civilization began to take its first steps. But the Nile not only nourished, it also divided. To the south lay Upper Egypt, a narrow valley where the river flowed swiftly between rocky hills. Life here was harsh, and its people, hardened, lived in close bond with the river. To the north stretched Lower Egypt, a vast delta of fertile plains, densely populated, with fields spreading all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. 2 lands, 2 characters, 2 kingdoms. Life revolved around the flood season and the harvest. They grew wheat, wove linen, domesticated cattle and sheep. In each reed-thatched home, beside the endless fields, early customs and beliefs began to take root. The sun god Ra who lit the world, the Nile god who granted sustenance, and a belief that death was merely a threshold to new life. They etched this faith into stone, turning symbols into hieroglyphs, turning images into an eternal language. Early Egyptian culture stood out for its profound connection between humans and nature. Every flood, every sunrise was sanctified. Every primitive tomb was a prayer for immortality. And between the 2 lands, Upper and Lower, there were conflicts and rivalries that eventually led to a great unification under a single pharaoh, King Narmer, around 3100 BCE. On a stone artifact known as a Narmer palette, the image of the king wearing both crowns, the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, stands as the clearest symbol of this unification. A firm hand forged 2 lands into a single empire. This event was not merely a military conquest. It marked a turning point from scattered communities and small states into one unified nation, with its first capital at Memphis, strategically placed between the 2 regions to maintain balance. From this point onward, the pharaoh was no longer just a king, but the embodiment of the divine on earth, ruling with both authority and sacredness. The moment Narmer unified Egypt was a drumbeat that signaled the birth of ancient Egyptian civilization, a civilization that would endure for more than 3 millennia and leave an immortal legacy in human history. Before Egypt had pharaohs and pyramids, this land underwent thousands of years of experimentation and adaptation. In Lower Egypt, communities like Merimd and Fayum, circa 5200 to 4500 BCE, lived near lakes and plains, sowing wheat and barley, raising cattle and goats, crafting coarse pottery, and building homes from reeds. They still hunted and foraged, but had already learned to store food for the dry season. Further south, in Upper Egypt, the Tajan people, around 4500 BCE, left behind simple earthen graves, where the deceased were buried with pottery and bead necklaces, early signs of belief in an afterlife. They were followed by the Hayfian community, 4400 to 4000 BCE, a small group in the Asiad, Sohag region. The Hayfians left reddish-brown pottery decorated with wave patterns and dotted motifs, along with modest burials that still included grave goods. They were not yet strong enough to spark major change, but they formed a vital bridge that prepared the way for the next stage of development. Around 5000 BCE, building on that foundation, the Badarian culture emerged in central Upper Egypt, where the first distinctive archaeological remains were discovered. The Badarian people were in the midst of transitioning from a hunter-gatherer society to settled agriculture. In other words, they had not fully abandoned the old ways and continued to practice both. When the Nile's floodwaters receded, the smooth, dark silt left behind became the fertile ground where they sowed emmer, wheat, and barley, two staple grains that would sustain the Egyptian people for millennia. Though agricultural productivity was still rudimentary, it was sufficient to feed the community. Alongside farming, they domesticated livestock. Cattle provided milk. Sheep and goats offered meat, wool, and hides, and pigs were raised in villages as a regular food source. Even so, the Badarians could not yet rely solely on agriculture. Hunting and foraging remained essential parts of daily life. Flint arrowheads and stone knives found in graves show they hunted antelope, gazelles, and even small crocodiles along the riverbanks. Women and children gathered berries, wild seeds, and edible plants along the shores to supplement their diet. Their tools were still primitive, but significant innovations had already appeared. They crafted knives and sickles from chipped flint with wooden handles, arrows from bone and stone, needles from bone, small hand axes for chopping wood, nets and fishing rods for catching fish. These inventions show that they begun combining various materials, stone, bone, wood, and plant fiber, to make tools adapted to their changing lives. Though their communities were small, traces of social organization had begun to appear. In each village, authority rested with a tribal chief who coordinated planting, hunting, and food distribution. There were young warriors, craftsmen, and a broad base of farmers and herders. His power was rooted in collective agreement, and he also led primitive riverside rituals, praying for the flood and the harvest. In the dusty soil of Badari, archaeologists have unearthed simple graves. The dead were laid on their side, wrapped in grass mats, buried with clay pots, bone or ivory necklaces, and sometimes stone knives. These objects were not random. They reflect a deeply human belief that death was not the end, but merely another journey, where the departed would still need food and tools to continue living. In those same graves, archaeologists also discovered fine pottery, deep red vessels with glossy black rims. These were produced using firing techniques so refined that even thousands of years later, the pottery still retains its luster. Every line, every simple motif, speaks silently of the earliest Egyptian craftsmen. Seen from today, Badarian culture may appear humble, yet it was from these early seeds that a civilization began to grow. The small riverside villages, the reed-thatched homes, the graves with pottery and adornments. They marked the first steps on Egypt's path toward becoming an eternal empire. By around 4000 BCE, following the Badarian period, the small riverside communities along the Nile had gradually grown in population and stability. Villages began to appear one after another along the riverbanks, and the fertile alluvial soil became the foundation for an increasingly agricultural way of life. It was also during this time that the first local centers emerged, most prominently in Upper Egypt, where clans began to unite, consolidate power, and set in motion the path toward the formation of early proto-states. Upper Egypt, from approximately 4000 to 3500 BCE, was the most dynamic region during the rise of the Naqada I culture. Situated along the narrow Nile Valley and flanked by scorched desert ranges, this land became the cradle of significant developments in Egypt's Predynastic history. Among the early centers, Hierakonpolis, the city of the falcon god Horus, rose to prominence as a nucleus of power, serving both as an embryonic political capital and as a religious hub. The people of Upper Egypt lived in close harmony with the Nile. They cultivated wheat and barley on the rich black silt, raised cattle, sheep, and goats for meat, milk, and hides. In addition to agriculture, crafts entered a new phase. Flax was woven into cloth, used both for clothing and for wrapping the dead. Flint tools grew more sophisticated. Axes and blades were meticulously sharpened, serving both productive and defensive purposes. Copper had just begun to appear, though still rare and used only in prized items. In the villages, power gradually became centralized in the hands of tribal chieftains. They controlled the land, coordinated agricultural seasons, and commanded warrior groups, forces tasked with protecting the community from wild animals and rival tribes alike. A clearer social hierarchy was beginning to emerge. At the top were the chieftains and their families, followed by warriors, craftsmen, and then the broader population of farmers and herders. Culture and art began to reflect these shifts. Thin red-black pottery, adorned with wave motifs, boats, and animals, served both practical and symbolic purposes. On desert cliffs, people carved scenes of hunting, boat processions, and human conflict, evidence of an increasingly complex and organized society. In cemeteries, the tombs of tribal leaders stood out for size and richness, filled with grave goods, pottery, jewelry, tools, offering a glimpse into growing belief in an afterlife. At the same time, religious beliefs became more clearly defined. People began to worship the forces of nature, the sun god who brought light, and the Nile god who bestowed silt and life. Communal rituals, such as grain offerings and prayers for the timely arrival of the flood, were not only acts of faith, but also threads that bound society together, uniting communities under a shared trust in divine protection. Lower Egypt during the Naqada period presented a contrasting yet complementary picture to Upper Egypt. The Nile Delta in the north, expansive and fertile, was one of the most bountiful plains of the ancient world. Unlike the narrow valley hemmed in by desert in the south, the delta opened onto a vast horizon, crisscrossed by river branches and teeming with birds, fish, and lush vegetation. From this deltaic region, Egypt had direct access to the Mediterranean and the Near East, allowing it to receive early waves of trade and cultural exchange. The life of Lower Egyptian inhabitants was rooted in their abundant agricultural base. On thick layers of silt, they not only cultivated wheat and barley, but also grew a variety of vegetables, crops that were difficult to farm in the south. Animal husbandry thrived, and along the riverbanks, fishing and the hunting of waterfowl provided a plentiful food supply. Notably, Madi, one of the region's major centers, emerged as a trade hub. From here, goods from the Near East, copper, cedar wood, and resin arrived overland or by sea and spread inland into Egypt. Traces of camels and donkeys suggest that residents had begun experimenting with overland transport using livestock, extending their trade networks well beyond the Nile Valley. However, the society of Lower Egypt had not yet formed the centralized political power seen in Upper Egypt. Its communities remained small and village-based, where leadership played more of a coordinating role in production and trade than one of absolute authority. As a result, though the delta was rich, it remained fragmented and did not give rise to powerful proto-states like Naqada or Hierakonpolis in the south. In terms of culture and art, Lower Egyptian pottery was typically simple, with little elaborate decoration, but it was durable and practical. Through trade, copper tools appeared earlier here, bearing marks of foreign influence from the Near East. The Mahdi cemeteries revealed distinct burial customs, small graves with few grave goods, reflecting a society that had not yet emphasized individual power or the display of status as seen in the South. Religious beliefs in Lower Egypt remained closely tied to the natural world. The fresh waters of the river, the fertile alluvial soil, schools of fish, and flocks of birds. Unlike Upper Egypt, where Hierakonpolis was already emerging as a religious center, Lower Egypt maintained a decentralized and diverse set of beliefs, with no dominant protective deity. Taken as a whole, the two regions of North and South had begun to follow divergent paths. Upper Egypt consolidated its power into early proto-states, gradually evolving into a strong political force. Lower Egypt became a gateway of commerce, connecting Egypt with the outside world. This very difference laid the groundwork for a historical rivalry that would culminate in a dramatic conquest and unification under Narmer, ushering in the dynastic era of ancient Egyptian history. After the Naqada period, Egypt entered a phase of accelerated growth. Upper Egypt, with key centers like Naqada, Abydos, and Hierakonpolis, gradually gained dominance. Local chieftains expanded their authority and organized military forces. The South became the political nucleus, where small states began to unite into larger power blocks. Meanwhile, Lower Egypt, with cities such as Madi and Buto, continued to serve as Egypt's gateway for trade. Its proximity to the Mediterranean and the Near East allowed for the steady import of copper, cedar wood, resin, and precious stones, which were then distributed throughout the Nile Valley. International relations flourished. From Nubia came gold, ivory, and animal skins. From the Near East, copper and fine woods. At the same time, warfare and military organization increasingly became tools for expanding influence, signaling a society on the verge of unification and state formation. During the Naqadite period, villages in Upper Egypt were only loosely connected, but by the time of Naqada II, Naqada and especially Hierakonpolis had evolved into true centers of power. Here, chieftains were no longer merely village leaders. They began to claim formal titles, assert their authority through ritual, military power, and elaborate burials, laying the groundwork for early kingship. A stable agricultural base generated surplus, giving rise to a noble class that controlled both production and trade. The military became a pillar of society, as depicted in carvings and pottery portraying warriors, processions, and warships. Rock carvings at Gebel El-Arak and Hierakonpolis reveal scenes of battle and territorial ambition, reflecting growing expansionist tendencies. Trade also intensified. Ornaments made from seashells, ivory, and imported gemstones became increasingly common. Burial practices, too, evolved. Graves were no longer modest as in Naqada I, but had grown into symbols of power, larger in size, containing multiple chambers and rich with grave goods. At Abydos and Naqada, these aristocratic tombs were precursors to royal mausoleums, representing a significant leap beyond earlier traditions. While Upper Egypt rose to become the dominant political force, Lower Egypt, with Mahdi and Buto, remained focused on trade with the Near East and the Mediterranean. The fertile delta sustained stable agriculture, but the northern region depended far more on international commerce than on political or military organization. Archaeological findings at Mahdi reveal numerous foreign artifacts, red copper, cedar wood, gemstones, and resin, all pointing to its role as a resource transit hub. However, pottery remained simple. Copper tools were mostly imported, and there was little sign of ritual art or militarization like that seen at Hierakonpolis. Society remained fragmented, with no strong ruling class. This disparity is clearly reflected in burial practices. Graves were small and sparsely furnished, in stark contrast to the multi-chambered elite tombs of Abydos, highlighting the growing power imbalance between north and south. If, during Naqada II, southern chieftains were still influential only within individual polities, then by the Naqada III period, 3200 to 3150 BCE, power had begun to concentrate significantly. The three major centers, Naqada, Abydos, and Hierakonpolis, became the political pillars of Upper Egypt. Hierakonpolis, in particular, rose as a proto-capital, serving both as a site of major rituals and as a military stronghold. Unlike earlier periods, the leaders of this era were no longer simply tribal heads. They began to assume the form of proto-kings, ruling over multiple villages, commanding armies, possessing grand tombs, and leaving symbols of their authority on artifacts. The military became a cornerstone of society. Warrior bands were organized, equipped with spears, axes, wooden shields, and warships to patrol the Nile. Conflict with the north and among southern city-states occurred frequently, laying the foundation for unification through warfare. Art was no longer just a reflection of daily life. It became a vehicle for power projection. Rock carvings and pottery began to depict bound prisoners, warrior processions, and chieftain rituals, clearly showcasing the dominance of the ruling elite. Tombs at Abydos were now constructed with multiple mud brick chambers and contained abundant grave goods. This marked a stark shift from Naqada II, when elite graves were only marginally larger than those of commoners. By Naqada III, such burials became statements of power and precursors to royal necropolises. Most notably, the first signs of writing emerged. Symbols etched onto pottery, ivory tags, and stone slabs at Abydos and Hierakonpolis. Though not yet full-fledged texts, these inscriptions function as identifiers, marks of authority and chieftain names, signaling the birth of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing, nearly contemporaneous with the cuneiform script of Mesopotamia. While Upper Egypt had developed powerful centers of authority, Lower Egypt, with important sites such as Mahdi and Buto, remained primarily a gateway for trade with the Near East and the Mediterranean. Wealthy from imported copper, cedar, resin, and gemstones, it lacked political consolidation. No single leader had the strength to stand against the southern forces. Burials in Lower Egypt were modest, with few grave goods, in stark contrast to the multi-room tombs filled with offerings in Abydos. This absence of elite tombs reflected the lack of a strong aristocracy. Ritual art and military iconography were virtually absent, and most copper tools were imports, revealing a society oriented more toward commerce and practicality than toward political or military strength. As a result, Lower Egypt became a land of wealth but weakness, and, in the eyes of Upper Egyptian rulers, an ideal target for expansion. This vulnerability opened the way for Narmer's campaign to unify North and South, ending the era of division. By around 3150 BCE, each major southern center, Naqada, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos, also known as Thinis, had its own ruler who controlled land, warriors, and religious rites. In their competition for supremacy, these rulers engaged in a prolonged series of conflicts, which historians often refer to as the Southern Civil War. Throughout this process, Thinis began to gain the upper hand. Its leaders not only relied on the fertile agricultural base surrounding them, but also leveraged their strategic location between Upper and Lower Egypt to dominate trade routes. Through military campaigns and political alliances, they gradually conquered neighboring polities, compelling smaller chieftains to submit. By the end of this period, a single dynasty based in Abydos emerged as the undisputed power in the south, later known as the Tenite dynasty, marking the dawn of pharaonic rule. Once the south had been unified, the rulers of Abydos and Hierakonpolis turned their gaze northward, to the fertile yet politically fragmented delta. The only viable route to the north was along the Nile, which now became the primary battleground. By this time, the Southern Army was highly organized. Warriors were equipped with spears, axes, and wooden shields, and they advanced aboard warships. Step by step, they seized ports, disrupted trade routes, and took control of key Nile branches. Archaeological evidence, particularly the carvings at Gebel el-Iraq, depicts intense scenes. Fleets loaded with soldiers, bound enemies on their knees, and prisoners being executed. During the same period, there were efforts in Lower Egypt to resist the southern advance. A number of artifacts, including pottery shards, seal impressions, and symbol carvings, mention a figure whom scholars refer to as the Bull's Head King, named after bull head symbol associated with him. This symbol likely represented strength, prosperity, and protection, an attempt to build a northern image of leadership. However, unlike Abydos, where power was consolidated and military forces well organized, the northern leaders such as the Bull's Head King remained fragmented across small communities. Despite their resources and trade connections, Lower Egypt lacked a unified political center capable of repelling the southern advance. These leaders thus appeared only as scattered voices of resistance, ultimately swept away by Upper Egypt's conquest. Before Narmer, history records another key figure, King Scorpion II. He is seen as a forerunner of Egypt's unification process, laying the groundwork for Narmer's eventual campaign. The clearest evidence of this is the scorpion mace head, a ceremonial artifact discovered at Hierakonpolis. It depicts the king holding a hoe during a ritual of canal cutting, an act symbolizing land cultivation, governance, and the granting of life. However, many scholars argue that the image also conveys political meaning. It represents military victory and territorial expansion into the north, especially since the same artifact includes depictions of captives and symbols of submission. During Scorpion II's reign, southern forces had already penetrated deep into the northern delta. He controlled key river routes, ports, and trade hubs. Yet, his power was not sufficient to impose full dominance over Lower Egypt. In other words, Scorpion II had extended southern influence and sown the seeds of unification, but he was not the one to complete it. Upon his death, power passed to his successors at Abydos, forming the foundation for Narmer to launch the final campaign that would defeat the north entirely and make him the first pharaoh in Egyptian history. After King Scorpion II's groundwork, Upper Egypt was strong enough to carry out a decisive campaign. The man who led that campaign was Narmer, the chieftain of Abydos, often regarded as the first pharaoh in history. Narmer inherited a solid foundation. Upper Egypt had already been unified under the Tenite dynasty. The military was organized, the economy was prosperous, and, crucially, the South had already gained experience in conquering the North under Scorpion. Narmer mobilized a powerful force, combining military strength with religious and political symbolism to assert his supremacy. The direct evidence of this campaign is the Narmer Palette, a ceremonial slate artifact regarded as a chronicle of that historic moment. On one side, Narmer is depicted wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, with a raised mace poised to strike a kneeling enemy, an image symbolizing the South's conquest of the North. On the reverse, he wears a red crown of Lower Egypt, overseeing a procession of bound captives under the watchful eye of the gods. This is a declaration. Narmer had become the ruler of both lands, uniting the country for the first time in history. The significance of the Narmer Palette extends far beyond its artistic value. It is a political proclamation in visual form, marking the birth of centralized kingship. The king was no longer just a military leader, but a sacred figure connected to the divine and wielding absolute power over unified Egypt. Following this campaign, Narmer established his capital at Memphis, located at the junction between North and South, a strategic site for controlling both the Delta and the Nile Valley. This moment marked the end of the Predynastic period, the beginning of the Early Dynastic period, and the dawn of a unified Egyptian civilization. Around the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE, Egypt emerged from the shadows of the Predynastic period and stepped into a new era, the Early Dynastic period, lasting from 3100 to 2686 BCE. This was a foundational age, when the first pharaohs transformed a once divided land into a unified nation, establishing Memphis as the capital to govern both Upper and Lower Egypt. During this time, the core elements of Egyptian identity were forged. Hieroglyphs evolved beyond symbolic signs into an administrative language. Tombs at Abydos and Saqqara developed into first mastabas. Royal rituals began to standardize, and the pharaoh was deified as a living embodiment of Horus. Kings like Narmer, Horah, Jur, and Den did more than leave their names on stelae and tombs. They etched themselves into the very structure of society, from the foundations of the bureaucratic system and a taxation apparatus to the use of imagery as a tool for projecting royal power. This was a period of great experimentation, during which a theocratic political cultural empire took shape, preparing the way for the glorious pyramid age of the Old Kingdom. Narmer, often identified with Menes, who ruled for about 50 years, laid the groundwork for the pharaonic dynasty. After unifying Upper and Lower Egypt, he established Memphis as the capital, precisely where the valley meets the delta, allowing for effective control over both regions. Here, a rudimentary administrative structure was formed, responsible for managing grain storage, land, and labor forces. For Narmer, power came not only from weaponry, but also from divine association. He linked himself to the god Horus, transforming the pharaoh into a divine king, the foundation of Egypt's future theocracy. Narmer married Nithotep, a princess of Upper Egypt, thereby consolidating royal power. She is believed to have been the mother of Horah, his successor. Horah, son of Narmer and Nithotep, ascended the throne after his father's death, around 3100 BCE. He strengthened Memphis. Artifacts bearing hieroglyphs on wooden labels and clay seals show that the state had begun operating a system for recording grain and land. Evidence of early administrative writing. Trade expanded. Ships from Memphis sailed south to Nubia for gold and ivory, and across desert routes to the Near East in exchange for copper and cedar. Funerary practices evolved. Tombs at Abydos grew larger. These were not merely burial places, but ceremonial spaces where the living affirmed the pharaoh's immortality. Horah is also believed to have established a temple to the goddess Neith at Sais, reflecting the blend of political and religious authority. The tomb of Nithotep and Nakata was also monumental, indicating her status as a founding queen, honored on par with royalty. Horah had several descendants, among whom Jur is recorded as a successor. Jur ascended the throne at a relatively young age, around 3050 BCE. His reign is marked by the construction of complex tombs at Abydos, accompanied by hundreds of subsidiary burials. This is clear evidence that royal power had far surpassed that of tribal chieftains. The pharaoh had become a divine figure who required a retinue even in death. Jur's wife, Herneth, was buried at Saqqara in a large mastaba, indicating the rising influence of royal women. After Jur's death, the throne passed to his son, Jet. Jet, son of Jur and Herneth, inherited the throne around 3000 BCE. He is remembered through a stela bearing the image of serpent, one of the earliest royal names written in hieroglyphs. His wife, Princess Merneth, was likely the mother of his successor, Den. Following Jet's death, the throne passed to Merneth, his wife and mother of the crown, Prince Denver. Although not always listed among official pharaohs, archaeological evidence shows that Merneth ruled as a true queen regent. While her son was still young, she governed in his place, actively managing the state. Administrative seals bearing her name, along with her large tomb at Abydos, comparable in scale to those of male kings and surrounded by subsidiary burials, demonstrate that both society and religion in Egypt accepted royal women as sovereigns. This set a critical precedent, paving the way for future female pharaohs. From Merneth's time onward, royal funerary rituals began to standardize. Tombs were no longer just burial chambers, but ritual spaces affirming the divine nature of kingship. When Den, son of Merneth and Jet, came of age, he assumed the throne and became one of the most powerful rulers of the First Dynasty, around 2990 BCE. Under his rule, Egypt was unified and stabilized to an unprecedented degree. Den was the first pharaoh to fully bear the title King of Upper and Lower Egypt, formalizing not only the practical unification of the land, but its political and symbolic unity as well. Art from his reign includes significant depictions, such as scenes of Den performing the said festival, a ritual held after many years of rule to renew the king's power, affirming that the pharaoh was not just a mortal leader, but one ordained by the cosmic order of Ma'at. His tomb at Abydos features stairways leading to multiple burial chambers and contain a vast array of grave goods, an architectural advancement foreshadowing the grand mastabas, and, eventually, the pyramids. During Den's reign, the administrative system and hieroglyphic writing reached new sophistication. Writing was now used not only for religious events, but for recording local names, taxes, and economic management. After Den, the final kings of the First Dynasty, Anagib, Semerkhet, and Qa, ruled toward the end of the 30th century BC. They inherited the throne from Den's lineage, but the royal court began to show signs of instability. Anagib struggled to maintain his grip on power. Semerkhet ascended amid signs of internal conflict, and some king lists report that the country faced crisis during this period. Even so, their reigns did not signal total collapse. Artistry in ivory, bone carving, administrative seals, and the hieroglyphic system continued to evolve, serving the management of grain stores, land, and state rituals. These traces suggest that despite courtly upheaval, the royal bureaucracy and cultural institutions continue to function effectively, laying the groundwork for the continuity of the Second Dynasty. When Qa, the last king of the First Dynasty, died, the throne passed to a new royal line, ushering in Dynasty II. This transition was not without unrest, but it maintained the continuity of Egyptian kingship. Looking back, from Merneth to Qa, the First Dynasty affirmed a foundational principle. The pharaoh was the absolute center of Egypt's political, religious, and cultural life. And even amid fluctuations in dynastic strength, belief in the divine kingship remained a unifying thread that held ancient Egypt together. Following the turmoil at the end of the First Dynasty, Egypt's throne passed into the hands of a new royal line, Hotep II. The founding king of the Second Dynasty ascended the throne around 2890 BC. His name, meaning the two powers are at peace, is believed to symbolize the restoration of stability after earlier conflict. During his reign, royal rituals were expanded, and ceremonies linking the pharaoh with the god Horus became increasingly standardized. He also laid the foundations for the development of funerary architecture at Saqqara, where the mastabas of officials gradually grew into massive mud-brick structures, reflecting the growing opulence and visibility of the elite bureaucracy. His successor, Ranab, also known as Nebra, marked a major turning point in Egyptian religion. On surviving seal impressions and inscriptions, Ranab was the first pharaoh to associate his royal titulary with the sun god Ra. This represents the earliest known step in Egypt's shift from local cults to a centralized national religion centered around solar worship, paving the way for the rise of the sun cult in the Old Kingdom. Under Ranab's reign, the state continued to strengthen its administration and expand religious rituals that tied Pharaoh's authority to the cosmic order of Ma'at. After Ranab, the throne passed to Ninetcher, one of the longest reigning monarchs of the Second Dynasty. During his extended reign, Egypt's trade networks expanded significantly. The kingdom maintained active exchanges with Nubia, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Near East. Artifacts from his time reveal that the administration was functioning efficiently, with officials overseeing provinces, grain storage, and religious festivals. However, toward the end of his reign, Egypt showed signs of instability. Some records suggest that the country may have split into two distinct centers of power. This was the first time since Narmer that Egypt's political unity appeared to falter. This period of upheaval reached its peak during the reign of Peribsen. On surviving monuments, Peribsen caused shock by abandoning the Horus falcon, the traditional symbol of pharaonic kingship, and adopting a royal title linked to Seth. Seth, the god of the desert, chaos, and war, was traditionally viewed as Horus's cosmic rival. Peribsen's alignment with Seth signaled a profound shift, both religious and political. It may reflect regional tensions, internal divisions, or even a crisis of divine authority. This was a pivotal moment, demonstrating that even in its formative years, the institution of kingship in Egypt was not immune to religious and political disputes. Following Peribsen's reign, Egypt descended into internal strife, until Khayskemwy restored unity. His throne name incorporated both Horus and Seth, symbolizing reconciliation after civil discord. This is the only instance in Egyptian history where a pharaoh explicitly associated himself with both deities, traditionally seen as opposites, as a statement of his dominion over all Egypt. Khayskemwy is also remembered for his architectural achievements. He initiated large-scale stone constructions at Hierakonpolis and Abydos, marking the first steps toward the stone pyramids of the Old Kingdom. His tomb at Abydos, Shunet el-Zebib, remains one of the largest surviving mud brick structures of ancient Egypt. It is considered a direct architectural predecessor of the step pyramids that would soon emerge. Khayskemwy's reign not only marked the end of Egypt's early period of turmoil, but also laid the foundation for the glorious Old Kingdom, where centralized power and architectural mastery reached unprecedented heights.